Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. Okay, we're doing something very different this week. Instead of just having me rattling on and on, we have me with Drew Pavlou. And let me introduce you to Drew. Drew is a student at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, who has been described by the LA Times as a star student. He's been on the Dean's List twice. He's won a poetry prize. He's pursued 3 majors simultaneously: philosophy, history, and English. But on July 24th, 2019, Drew got a text message. It said, quote, "China is not something your country can provoke. White trash pig. I will hire a killer through the deep web and then kill your family. Your mother will be raped till dead." That message was part of a Chinese effort to squelch Drew's freedom of speech, an effort that seems to have emanated from the Chinese government, probably the Chinese diplomatic mission in Australia. Eventually, the story of the battle between the Chinese government and one brave college student, that's Drew, made it into the LA Times and the New York Times. So, Drew.
Yes.
Can you tell me the story of what happened to you, complete with the physical violence and all?
Of course. And thank you for such a magnificent introduction, Howard. I really appreciate you lending your platform to help me raise awareness about what's happened here in Australia and try and spread what's happened, here, right there in America as well. It is a pretty crazy story. Basically, you've given a very good overview. I was just simply I was simply a student, devoted myself to philosophy, history, English literature. I was never really an activist. And I suppose last year, as we saw more and more terrible violence occurring in Hong Kong, as we found out more and more about the terrible concentration camps China has erected in the province of Xinjiang to house Uyghurs, to basically persecute people for their Islamic faith. It's arguably one of the worst cultural genocides ongoing in the world today. And it even increasingly meets the definition for a physical genocide. We now have evidence that in these concentration camps, the Chinese government has tried to forcibly lower the Uyghur birth rate through the use of sterilization. There have been forced abortions. There have been instances where Uyghur women have been forced to marry Han men. So it's almost like a state-sanctioned program of rape in order to try and dilute the Uyghur ethnic race. And as I learned more and more about these terrible atrocities, it just, woke up a fire inside of me. And suddenly I could no longer simply devote all my energies to studying. I've always been someone who has loved the world of ideas. I've loved intellectual life. I love studying. I love writing. University was, one of the great joys of my life. But I guess it just sort of woke a fire in me, and it made me think I have to be doing more. It's not enough simply to just, devote myself to intellectual life. No matter how much joy it gives me, I have to cross over into the world of action. That was my thinking at the time. And so I was just simply outraged watching what was happening in Hong Kong, seeing people my age being bashed by like riot police in the street. I was just increasingly disgusted by the atrocities going on against Uyghur Muslims. Of course, we all know the ongoing terrible treatment of Tibetans as well, the persecution of people for their Buddhist faith, the imprisonment of hundreds of monks and nuns simply for practicing Tibetan culture. And so these terrible atrocities, it just woke a fire in me. I looked around, and I've always been someone who, I guess, probably predominantly identifies with the left. When I first really became passionate about politics, it was following the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2015, 2016.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I was like really woken up by that. That was my first sort of political awakening. And so I've always identified with the left. And I was just shocked that not many people on the left were speaking about what was happening in China. So in Australia, China is Australia's largest economic trading partner. It is so important to, Australian billionaires and oligarchs, and the trade with China is just so important to the economy. And because of that economic importance, people were basically sticking their head in the sand when it came to these terrible atrocities. And when people looked away from these atrocities because of the economic importance, there was also an element of the left that wanted to try and ignore what was happening because, they really bite the Chinese government propaganda line, hook, line, and sinker. The Chinese propaganda being, to criticize the Chinese state is to criticize the Chinese people. You're simply awakening up that long latent history of anti-Asian and anti-Chinese racism in Australia and other Western countries by criticizing this state, et cetera, et cetera. So, it was just simply like mind-numbingly stupid identity politics. You're not supposed to talk about this terrible genocide against Muslims, this terrible genocide against Buddhists, this horrible crackdown on students in Hong Kong, simply because to criticize the Chinese government, this dictatorship that does not represent the Chinese people at all, to criticize it is to somehow be racist and to be awakening all these racist sentiments lingering in society. So people on the left were just basically hiding their heads in the sand on this issue. And, on the right, they were just simply trying to ignore it because the economics were so important. Vested interests are so important to Australian political parties. We still don't have any sort of independent government corruption watchdogs at a national level. And I was just shocked, man. I just was like, it just made me want to, it made me want to explode with anger. And I wanted to just basically raise my voice as loud as I could to simply wake people up, to basically scream from every single rooftop. Why are people being silent on these atrocities? Why are we ignoring our closest economic trading partners' terrible cruelties? I just wanted to wake people up, and I wanted to be as disruptive and annoying as possible. And so I guess it was from there that I became an activist. I organized the first protest I'd ever organized in my entire life. We held a very small sit-in. We only had 15, 20 people. It was not necessarily, well organized because it wasn't my first ever rally, but we did start out from the idea that we wanted to be as disruptive as possible. So we thought, what would be the day that would really try and wake up students at UQ? And I think this is probably true when it comes to universities across the board. Like, there has been such a wave of depoliticization. Sorry, my dog's just barking. Let me get the dog quickly. Sorry, man.
It looks adorable.
Sorry, I've got to dash out, and I still live at home with the family. So, sorry, Max, don't ruin my interview. It'll just sit there. So we did try and be as disruptive as possible. There's been this wave of depoliticization across universities all across the world, I think, in recent years. Back in the old days, students used to be radicals. They would oppose the government. Students led the fight against apartheid. At my university, the University of Queensland, it's got this long tradition as one of Australia's most radical campuses. So when the South African segregated rugby teams, the Springboks, came to Queensland back in the 70s and 80s, the University of Queensland students led the way, protesting against these apartheid era teams, trying to basically call for boycotts, divestment, sanctions of the South African apartheid government. We had this terrible era of authoritarian state rule in Queensland through the 70s and 80s under a man called Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen. A bit like the Australian Trump. Not many people, I think, know about him, but he ruled by a gerrymander and, presided over tremendous, immense corruption and tried to crack down on free speech and civil liberties and presided over a wave of police violence. And the University of Queensland, again, was at the center of radical opposition to the Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen government. So traditionally, historically, the University of Queensland was this radical campus. But in recent years, and I think it's probably to do with, increasing way that universities have become corporatized and things like that over the past few decades, student support has really plummeted. So, the government no longer supports students going to universities as they once did. Universities used to be free in Australia. Now it's so expensive to go to them, as same case in America. And so students, often are working very long hours, part-time jobs just to survive, working 40, 50-hour weeks alongside their full-time studies. And so no one has the time to protest. No one has the time to be political. And over the last 20, 30 years, the University of Queensland, that radical culture has just been completely lost. And we really, really wanted to wake people up to that. So we thought market day, the day on campus where you're going to have 40, 50,000 students there, everyone's going to be on campus. We will hold a sit-in in a really busy walkway on campus, try and block the pathway, make people think and reflect about what's happening. We're just trying to basically politicize the student body again. We didn't really think about, media. We never thought about how it could blow up. Never in a million years would have thought that, I'd be in this position today, 1.5 years later, talking to someone like you, talking to LA Times journalists, because it was crazy what ultimately happened. We started with the intention, simply trying to wake up UQ students, trying to make people radical again. And then suddenly, because basically hundreds of Chinese nationalists opposed us on that day, they surrounded us. They tried to shut down the rally violently. They assaulted us. I was punched in the back of the head. I was punched in the back of the head, punched in the ribs, punched in the mouth, thrown to the ground. There was a Hong Kong student who was with us. She had her dress ripped. Another Hong Kong student was choke slammed to the ground. A security guard, other Hong Kong students were bitten. Probably that day, 6 or 7 people on our pro-democracy side were assaulted violently by what was a coordinated attempt. This was a coordinated attempt by this crowd of Chinese ultra-nationalists, basically fascist thugs. As you made a point, I think, in that video on YouTube, you can imagine these people with the red MAGA hats, storming and trying to shut down protests violently. Unfortunately, no one on the Australian left really cared, that because, they want to pretend.
No one on the left cared?
I mean, some did, but to this day, a year and a half later, I think it's 3 members of parliament from the left have 3 elected left-wing officials in the entirety of Australia since that day in July 2019 have ever spoken out publicly in support of me. In Britain, 4 British MPs spoke out in favor of me. So a year and a half later, I've had more British MPs support me from halfway across the world than left-wing elected Australian officials.
Astonishing.
Yeah, astonishing. Amazing. So, I mean, people did try and pretend it didn't happen, which is just insane, because it was when you looked at it, these guys were chanting slogans like Hong Kong dogs, Hong Kong is a vermin, and stuff like that.
Amazing.
They were calling us white trash. It was like a Han supremacist, racial supremacist rally. It had all the hallmarks of a fascist rally. They came with a big boom speaker trying to play the chat so that they could play the Chinese national anthem over our chants. And they were just chanting these nationalist slogans. They were calling us white trash, white pigs, calling the Hong Kongers dogs and vermin, calling them Hong Kong zombies. They held up flags saying Hong Kong is the dogs, but signs saying Hong Kong is the dogs, Hong Kong is part of China, things like that. And they, hurled insults. They spat over us. They poured drinks over us. It was just, it still beggars belief to this day that this would happen on an Australian university campus in a free democratic country like Australia. Basically, this huge fascist rally of 300, 400 ultra-nationalists trying to put down people with violence. And, no one has ever been, one person was charged by police 12 months after the rally. And that was only after immense public pressure after a whole year. Initially, when we went to the police trying to file charges, they basically ignored us. We filed 3-4 police reports.
That's astonishing.
The whole thing is just crazy. And so it's been my life since it's happened. It's just changed dramatically. It's like living in topsy-turvy land. I started
Well,
out.
but is there evidence that this was organized by the Chinese embassy or by Chinese officials?
See, that's the million-dollar question. The day after the violence occurred, the Chinese Consul General in Brisbane, so the highest diplomatic official representing China in my state of Queensland, he put out a statement endorsing the violent attacks, endorsing the
Amazing, astonishing,
endorsing the students for their spontaneous patriotism against the separatists. Separatism,
right? And spontaneous patriotism is the phrase. I mean, I mentioned this is exactly the phrase that they use whenever thugs like this are organized in China to put down protests.
Yes, spontaneous patriotism, and to call us separatists in China, separatism carries the death penalty. It is a capital offense. I mean, it is like almost a higher crime than murder, rape, pedophilia, whatever it be. This crime of separatism, they put you to death for it. And so when he goes, we congratulate the students on their spontaneous patriotism opposing the separatists, and I'm named as the separatist in Chinese state media. What happens? A wave of.
And your parents are Greek, not Chinese.
Yeah, and a wave of death threats basically poured over me and my family when that happened. Once he basically gave this green light, they're separatists. Then a wave of death threats flowed over us. There were rape threats against my mother. I just got all these messages, hundreds of messages, and they were going. Some of the worst were like, "We will rape and torture your family in front of you, kill you. We'll hire a hitman on the dark web. We'll hire killers to go after you. This is for opposing China in Australia." And I mean, it's the million-dollar question whether it was organized by the Chinese consulate. No one knows to this day. But I mean, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence on the day that suggested that there was an organized element to this rally. So, for example, there were about 4 or 5 men in that crowd who were there on that day to sow violence. These were guys who were wearing dark sunglasses. They had earpieces in speaking to one another.
Amazing.
I know.
So they looked like the secret police.
Yeah, some of them had like face masks, and this is pre-COVID, so it's quite rare.
Right.
Face masks with skeletal teeth across them. They've got backpacks with changes of clothes in them, and they basically converged on us from multiple angles. At the exact same time, they began playing the Chinese national anthem. They attacked me from multiple angles, and later that day, basically, it eventually ended up in a standoff. They had to bring in police. There was a police helicopter. There were 20, 30 police officers trying to hold the crowds apart because we were so terrified that they were going to just basically, they already had us surrounded. We were scared that they were going to storm the hill we were on and basically savage us. And the police were trying to negotiate a peaceful end to the standoff. We were saying, we just want to end this. We just want to leave peacefully. We don't want any violence. We've just basically held a peaceful rally and we want to leave. And the leader of the Chinese nationalist crowd, who was brought over to speak to me in the police negotiations to end the standoff, he went, "There are people in my crowd who are not students. If you don't apologize to the Chinese nation for offending Chinese honor, I can't guarantee your safety." And they basically
Amazing.
Yeah, and they said this in full view of the police and UQ security officials. And then they basically said, "We won't let you leave peacefully until you apologize for holding your peaceful protest, for offending China and the Chinese nation." And we, of course, refused to apologize for holding a peaceful rally at my own university, in my own country, as a democratic citizen, refused to apologize. And so we had to leave under police escort, basically. It's just insane.
Well, let me just paint a little bit of context for the people listening to this. Xi Jinping, it's Xi Jinping, I've been taught. At any rate, Xi Jinping became or worked his way up to the head of China about 8 years ago. And then about 3 years ago, he named himself dictator for life, basically. And he has taken China, which under the Deng Xiaoping philosophy of get rich quick, was a relatively open society, and he has closed it again. He has said that only his way of thought is the real way of thought of the Chinese people. So Mao wrote a little red book, and everybody was required to basically memorize it and repeat it every time they possibly could and not think outside of its boundaries. That was a long time ago. We don't expect that from China anymore. But Xi Jinping has deliberately set himself up as the new Mao Zedong. So Mao Zedong wrote a little red book. Xi Jinping has written a little yellow book. What are you supposed to do with the little yellow book? Memorize it. Copy out page by page, by hand, the words of Xi's book, Xi's philosophy. And Xi has inserted his philosophy into the Chinese constitution as the Chinese dream. It includes an audacious space dream, which is aimed at owning the solar system, colonizing the solar system on behalf of the Han people. And then going further, this is the first step to owning the stars. Just the way the Chinese own the South China Sea. In the early 2000s, China signed a deal that said it was peaceful. It was going to get along with, there were 7 nations that claimed rights to the South China Sea. China was only one of them, and it swore to a peace deal with the other 6 contenders. Then it started taking reefs and turning them into islands. And when it turned them into islands, it said, these are for peaceful purposes only. Anybody who says that we have any military goal with this is offending the Chinese people, is smearing our reputation. Then they had alleged fishing boats swarming the South China Sea, which most intelligence observers think many of them were basically a Coast Guard. They were military. They were not the civilian fishing boats that they pretended to be. Then China built military bases on these reefs that it was turning into islands. And then it came out and let it be known that, hey, we own the South China Sea. We've always owned the South China Sea. Look at our history. It's been a part of China forever, which wasn't, of course, true. So that's the Chinese method. Move slowly, step by step. When you are weak, keep your strength hidden. Only when you are strong, reveal your strength. And now what China is trying to do with Australia is make a test case, basically, make an example for the West. And China, Xi Jinping has laid out a tremendously ambitious $20 trillion Belt and Road Initiative that involves roughly 66 nations. It's more than 66, and half the world's population. And it wants the kind of ability to censor the people within those nations, slowly but surely, inch by inch, over the course of time, so that in 10 years, it can censor those people the way it censors people in China itself, making everyone bow to Xi Jinping thought. And Australia's being used as a test case to demonstrate to the West that Australia can use this form of thuggery, enforced censorship, wherever it wants in the world. So if you are in Virginia, if you are in Seattle, if you are in San Francisco, if you are in Nebraska, the form of thuggery that Drew has just experienced is coming to you soon if we don't wake up and stop it. And we have to stop it in Australia first. And as Drew said, 1/3 of Australia's exports go to China. People are getting rich in the mining industry in particular, off of sending everything they can possibly yank out of the soil or from beneath the soil of Australia to China as raw materials. China is not using Australia for its talents, for its people. It's using Australia simply to suck everything that it can out of Australia and turn it into profitable goods that it can sell to you and me. Well, okay, that's fine. That's how humans grow, by gaining new powers, by having new devices, and those new devices are made from materials that come from Australia in part. But they're ignoring value-added stuff from Australia. The people from Australia are relevant only as a test case to show we can squash these fucking Westerners who say that they live in a free world with our thumb, and they won't notice when we do it in Australia. They won't notice when we pick off when we do it in Hawaii. They won't notice when we do it in Seattle. They won't notice until we've got our thumb on them and they are fucked.
Yeah.
So sorry for such an emotional rendition of this.
It's true.
So tell us what happened after this incident.
Yes.
I mean, of course, universities are dedicated. Read their catalogs. They are all dedicated to freedom of speech and Western values, every single one of them. So tell us how your brave and courageous university stood up for you against these fascist thugs.
Yes. Well, the story just gets better, more bravery on the part of Australian institutions. So the context you've provided is absolutely correct. Basically, China views Australia as a test case in which it can use its economic leverage to achieve political ends. The political ends being making sure that there is no criticism of the Chinese government's terrible human rights abuses, whether that be against Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, ordinary Chinese people itself. They basically just want people to toe to the Chinese government official propaganda line. And they use economic leverage to achieve these political ends. And Australia is only now just waking up to this. It's been 30, 40 years it's been 30 years in the making, and now we've woken up to it. And we've woken up to it at a time where we've realized the situation is already so dire. So many Australian institutions have been economically captured. Basically, now China accounts for basically a third of Australia's exports. Those exports being primarily without, as you said, without the value added, it's just raw material exports. And what happens when you have an economy based around what happens when you have an economy without sufficient complexity? You're basically just exporting raw materials to a totalitarian dictatorship. Well, it becomes very easy for China to then exercise vast power over huge sectors of the Australian economy. So you look at the people who are now criticizing the Australian government. We're in a period where basically over the last 6 to 7 months, the Australian-Chinese relationship has completely imploded. The Chinese government does not even try and pretend now that this is a relationship of equals. It does not even try and pretend now that there is any diplomacy to be had between these two countries. It is just simply punishing Australia and doing it in a very open and transparent way, punishing Australia with trade war, with trade barriers, sanctions, trade war, punishing Australia for
an 81% tariff on barley, which makes Australian barley unaffordable in China.
Yep, and overnight they made Australian wine unaffordable in China. They've basically cut off all exports outside of iron ore exports, whether it be coal, barley, whether it be wine, lobsters. Huge Australian industries have been hit. And what happens? Well, all the leaders of these Australian industries then attack the Australian government, begging the Australian government, please capitulate so that the economic pain stops. So just a few years ago, there was a really terrible case where China held up wine shipments for 1 or 2 weeks at its ports because Australia had dared to speak out on an issue of human rights. And what did the leaders in the wine industry do? They begged the Australian government to back down so that they could get the wine off the port floor. Now you see people like Twiggy Forests. These are billionaires who've made all their wealth exporting iron ore and coal, etc., to China. They are now some of the most high-profile critics of the Australian government's human rights approach to China. They beg the Australian government to capitulate. They criticize and try and undermine any critics of the CCP in Australia. And the
CCP is the Chinese Communist Party, which runs China.
Exactly, the Chinese government, the party state, because the state and the party are one in China. And now it's happened in Australian universities. So Australian universities higher education became one of Australia's key export industries over the past few decades, primarily when it came to Chinese students. The growing Chinese middle class increasingly looked to Australia to send off their students to, get credentials, pad their resumes, come back, build a nation, etc. And we're now at the situation where a university like mine, the University of Queensland, 20% of the overall revenue the university has every year comes from simply Chinese students alone. It's the same at the University of Melbourne, the University of Sydney, the University of New South Wales, the top Australian universities. I mean, there's this group of 8, right? And they try and style themselves as the Australian equivalent of the Ivy League. And the group of 8, as a whole, they're all their business models rely on Chinese government, rely on continued exports to China, come in the form of obviously Chinese students studying. The Chinese government, as a totalitarian government, it's shown over the past few years, especially with this recent trade war against Australia, that it is more than willing to link its economic leverage to its political aims in a society. And so what happened when there were these protests on Australian campuses? Basically, the Chinese government, in both official Chinese state media and probably behind the scene as well, they basically let the university leaderships, let them know that they would link the continued ability of Chinese students to study at these universities to the universities acquiescing to attempts to shut down free speech and speech critical of China. So it starts probably 2013 when the Dalai Lama comes to Sydney. The academics at the University of Sydney invite him to speak and lecture at the university. This is a Nobel Peace Laureate. So, what a great honor to have a Nobel Peace Prize winner attend your university to deliver a public lecture. Well, not so for the university administration, because the university administration headed by Vice Chancellor Michael Spence, who's on a salary of $1.5 million a year. His salary completely directly linked to the ongoing, masses of money coming in from China. Yep. He bans the Dalai Lama from speaking on campus.
Amazing.
Yeah, amazing. And for some reason, this is just accepted in Australian public life. He does not receive much criticism for it. The government just allows it to happen. And so the Dalai Lama in the end has to speak in a random place off campus, nowhere, not linked to the University of Sydney at all. And Michael Spence puts out the statement, this is a tremendous outcome for the university. Then it continues as a march of this. So at a university in Victoria, someone wanted to hold a screening criticizing Confucius Institutes. This film in the name of Confucius, a documentary series about how Confucius Institutes are basically tied to the Chinese government as agents of influence. Confucius Institutes are these study centers that are directly funded by the Chinese government with full Chinese government educational control over the curriculum. And they've set themselves up in universities in the European Union, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all across the world, basically to try and make sure that where universities are teaching Chinese language courses, the Chinese language courses are going to be taught by approved party cadres who will not be asking any uncomfortable questions about the Chinese government, party state's history. Someone wanted to hold a screening about the Confucius Institutes in the name of Confucius at a Victorian university. That screening was shut down. The university did not allow it to happen on campus. And then the Hong Kong protest was when it really, really blew up. And that was with our protest at UQ. So at UQ, we have 900 Hong Kong students, 9,000 Chinese students. And
amazing.
Yeah, and
that's a huge.
Yeah, and UQ relies on China, again, as I said, for about 20% of its overall revenue, about 200 million Australian dollars every year. So if you look at that over a decade, it's a billion dollar relationship. To try and make sure the relationship is run smoothly, the University Vice Chancellor, Peter Hoy, who recently stepped down on his own terms. Unfortunately, he was never punished for how he treated me. He very much championed and trumpeted ties with China. So he was on the board of Hanban, the Chinese government institution that oversees Confucius Institutes worldwide. He was actually on the board of that institution. And he was awarded the Most Outstanding Individual of the Year award in 2015 by China's Vice Premier for his efforts promoting Confucius Institutes worldwide. And as we know, the Chinese government runs Confucius Institutes. They run on the party line. He was basically being awarded by the Chinese government for promoting Chinese propaganda. And
Is this the officer at your university who's getting this award?
Yes, this is basically the president of the university, the vice chancellor, the equivalent of CEO of the university. He
Amazing.
was getting a Chinese government award for spreading Chinese propaganda, and he's on a salary.
By the way, just so that the audience knows this, the Chinese Communist Party, much as it has been using capitalism to succeed ever since 1980, when Deng Xiaoping opened up the country to capitalist enterprise, the Chinese Communist Party still teaches Marxism and Leninism as the basic core of their creed. So when Drew is talking about how the Confucius Institutes use party cadres, a party cadre is a dedicated political propagandist under strict party discipline who has proven himself to the party by being faithful, loyal, and true to the party's word on everything, even if that word changes from one week to another totally. And at the heart of all of this is Marxist-Leninism, and many China experts have been pointing out that what Xi Jinping has been doing in establishing himself as the new emperor of China is out of the Stalin playbook.
Yes.
It's out of how Stalin put together the Soviet Union, which, by the way, was a land-grabbing empire. It didn't look colonialistic and imperialistic to us because we're accustomed to people spreading on ships the way the English spread their imperialism. But there is another form of imperialism, and it's, I am a big empire. There are lots of countries on my boundaries. I need to set up a zone of safety so I can protect myself. So I will absorb those zones on my boundary. Oh, wow, I've got new boundaries. That means I've now got boundaries with other countries, and I have to set up my zone of safety around myself. And I no longer have that because I've absorbed the countries that are my old boundaries of safety. So I need to establish new boundaries of safety. Oh, wow, I've just taken in even more territory. It's like a great galumphing amoeba, swallowing everything in sight. But this is an amoeba that goes from microscopic to swallowing a bunch of other amoebae and eventually swallows your entire living room, complete with your couch and your television set. So that's the kind of land grabs that China's in the process of doing. In 1948, I think it was, it swallowed Tibet on its borders. The South China Sea is another example of this. And the Soviet Union under Stalin, who is a role model for Xi Jinping, did the same damn thing until it ended up swallowing Poland, Western Germany, Czechoslovakia. It tried to swallow Greece, and that's where the West put its foot down and said, swallow no further.
Yes.
So now we're up against this new Marxist-Leninist Stalinism in the form of Xi Jinping. Okay, back to your story.
Yeah.
So the brave and courageous people at your university.
Yeah. Well, before I quickly go back to the UQ story, I just want to say, you're right. He looks to Stalin as a model. Xi Jinping and the party cadres at the top of the CCP at the moment, they've intensely studied the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and they have tried to draw lessons from the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And basically the lessons they have drawn is that from the Khrushchev thaw, the Soviet Union weakened itself, and it took the boot off the neck of the national minorities under its control. And they believe that the Soviet Union undid itself through weakness, and so they are determined to avoid the mistakes of the Soviet Union by restructuring along this Stalinist model, returning to basically Maoist lines. And it's this incredibly toxic fusion, as you know, of Marxist-Leninism, this horrible totalitarian ideology, with this particular form of Han supremacism. I think that's the element Xi Jinping has really injected into the mix increasingly in recent years. And it's the part that a lot of people on the left in the West are not completely conversant with. They don't see just the racial underpinning of Xi Jinping's rule, because you now look at places like Xinjiang and Tibet, and it's actually increasingly these increasingly resemble apartheid colonial settler states where Han people are in the majority, and the ethnic minorities, whether they be Tibetan or Uyghur, they are kept under, they've got the boot to their necks. They're kept under firm control. When it comes to Uyghurs,
well, they're more than kept under firm control. They're infiltrated with as many Han as possible.
Yes.
Then there are institutions. The institutions of the Tibetans have been dismantled one by one, bit by bit, and Han institutions and Han infrastructure have been put in their place. And the goal is to marginalize the Tibetans to the point where this is Han territory, period. It's obvious to everybody. Walk around the streets of the major cities. What are you going to see? Han Chinese.
Yeah. It's a process of Sinicization, they call it. And now Tibetans and Uyghurs are...
What was that word?
Sinicization.
Oh, Sinicization, right, got it.
And now Uyghurs and Tibetans are now minorities in their own homelands, because there has been a project of... There's actually been a colonial settler project. It actually resembles in many ways the colonial settler history of, say, a country like Australia. This is the frustrating part, you see so many... We often call them the tankies, right? The supporters of these Marxist-Leninist dictatorships, and they describe themselves as leftists, and they will rail, rightly so, against the terrible histories of colonialism that occurred in places like Canada and Australia, where Indigenous people did face genocide, and yet they support a country that is looking to those models of genocide and trying to implement them here, implement them there. Like for example, in Australia, one of the darkest chapters in Australian history, and to some extent, people are right in saying that it continues today. The Stolen Generations chapter in Australian history, one of the darkest chapters. It was an attempt. It was outright genocide, an attempt to take Indigenous children and absorb them into white society and eliminate their Indigenous heritage by putting them in homes and taking them from their families and their towns. And now China, the policies they undertake towards Uyghurs, they resemble completely the stolen generation policies of Australia. You see Uyghurs taken from their families. Uyghur children in many cases are orphaned because both parents are taken to the concentration camps, and then they are taken to schools where they are taught Mandarin. They are forbidden from speaking Uyghur. The Chinese government tries to wipe their Uyghur culture and heritage from them. So it's a genocidal ethno-state. The Han, this is a genocidal Han ethno-state under Xi Jinping. That's what the left, I think,
and it's racist. Back in the days of World War II, the Japanese were very racist. They felt they had a pure race. They felt that they were descended from the sun goddess, Amaterasu. They felt they were the only descendants on this planet. Their race was the only descendant of the sun god. And they were out to spread the glory of their race. That's why it was so easy for them to ally with Adolf Hitler. Well, because he also was a genocidal racist. My impression is that Han supremacy as a supremacism is similar. But I haven't been able to find enough information to see if that's true.
A very good book on this subject, which I would encourage you and also all your viewers to read, would be Bill Hayden's The Invention of China. And he really expertly details how at the turn of the 19th century, as the Qing Empire under the Manchus was faltering, a small group of Han revolutionary nationalists begun to basically lay down the foundations of a modern Chinese nationalism. And in the process of doing so, they borrowed heavily from Western ideas about nationalism. They borrowed heavily from Herbert Spencer's social Darwinist views, in which the world was divided up into races and were doomed to and these races were doomed to collapse into competition with one another in a struggle for supremacy. These ideas found themselves working their ways into the foundations of modern Chinese nationalism. And that's why the modern Chinese nationalism that's championed by Xi Jinping, it's a Han nationalism. It's a very racialized nationalism. That's the problem that the left is increasingly completely, that's what the left is failing to see. And
right, so here's the deal, as I see it. and I'm only summing up what you've been saying, and that is that right now the Chinese are indulging in imperialism and colonialism,
Yes.
and they want more of it. That's why they're trying to squash freedom of speech in Australia. They want absolutely no criticism of, especially, I mean, the chant you used during your demonstration was, hey, hey, ho, ho, Xi Jinping has got to go.
Yeah.
And that might have been your ultimate sin, because you were cursing the name of God himself. God is Xi Jinping.
As soon as
it's the commitment of the left, which started with anti-colonialist movements. The first international anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist conference was in 1899, 121 years ago. And we become aware of all of the atrocities that you have just mentioned, because we did the same thing to the Native Americans of the United States as you did to your Aborigines. We took the children away from their families and tried to educate them as good Christian white people. And we become aware of these things. We are not doing them anymore. We object to doing them. But if indeed the left is committed to anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, why it must object to what China is doing, or it's lying and it should go home and hide in its bedroom in shame.
Yes, of course. Because you can't turn a blind eye to imperialism and racism and state colonial genocide. You can't turn a blind eye to genocide, state colonialism, imperialism, simply because, you know, this is an anti-imperialist Marxist-Leninist state, and by definition, the Leninist states cannot be imperialist. Like, this is how these brain-dead tankies think, and it's mind-numbing, because you ask a Tibetan or a Uyghur, what is it like under this anti-imperialist state? And I'm sure they will enlighten you as to what the reality of this government and dictatorship is. But again, going back to the story at UQ, Peter Hoy, the vice chancellor, the president of the university, was given $1.3 million salary. He was given a $200,000 bonus. This was a secret bonus, and it was linked to his efforts developing the relationship with China. He was given an award by the Chinese government. The vice premier of China strung a medallion around his neck for his efforts promoting the Chinese propaganda worldwide. Under his control of the university, during his terrible reign over the university, the Confucius Institute, basically as a front for the Chinese government, begun funding 4 separate courses. So we're saying the reality is 4 courses at the University of Queensland, one of Australia's premier universities that tries to liken itself to, you know, an Ivy League university in America. 4 courses at this university were directly funded by the Chinese government. And these courses, one course, for example, Understanding China, when it came to discussing the genocide of Uyghurs with the imprisonment of Uyghurs in concentration camps, they parroted the Chinese government propaganda line to the T. They said Uyghurs are overrepresented in terror statistics. Uyghurs are all terrorists. This is why the Chinese government has to have a crackdown and anti-terror campaign against Uyghurs. That is the Chinese government's propaganda line to justify the imprisonment of 1 million Uyghurs based on their race and cultural identity in concentration camps. When it came to the Hong Kong protests, students were asked to debate in class, are the Hong Kong protests a form of terrorism, which is, again, the Chinese government's propaganda line. This was being taught to students at the University of Queensland, one of Australia's premier universities, with the funding of the Chinese government. So just shocking what was going on. And the Confucius Institute at the University of Queensland, it was promoted by Peter Hoy and Peter Varghese, the chancellor of the university, so basically the ceremonial head above Peter Hoy. It was championed as, you know, this premier cultural and language learning institution. But who were the academics assigned to the Confucius Institute? Well, we now know, after intensive research, that the academics assigned to the Confucius Institute at UQ were not necessarily devoted solely to the teaching of language and culture, as the university heads tried to tried to tell everyone. No, in fact, these were experts in nanotechnology, metallurgy, civil military helicopter development. There were scholars who recruited straight from China with military research backgrounds, and they basically went straight to UQ under the auspices of the Confucius Institute, were awarded Australian government and UQ research grants, and with these research grants, basically begun further researching these very sensitive military technology matters to then be transported back to China to help develop weapons and arms to be used against Australia as a hostile enemy, and also to be used against Uyghurs and Tibetans when they are persecuted. One man at UQ, he was one of the youngest men ever appointed to a professorship at UQ in its history, Heng Taoshen. He's since left to China, but he is still an honorary professor at UQ to this day. He pioneered AI surveillance research. He then, using UQ research grants and Australian government research grants, Heng Taoshen pioneered research into AI technology. Then he went to China, created a surveillance technology that used AI to track Uyghurs, and it's now being used by the Chinese government to track Uyghurs in Xinjiang. He used Australian government money and UQ resources to directly aid the genocide of the Uyghur people. So this is the situation at UQ, just intensive infiltration on the part of the Chinese government. And UQ resources being used not just to UQ resources were used not just to apologize for and defend genocide. UQ resources were actually used directly to benefit and facilitate the Chinese government's genocide. So we held this protest. How did the university respond? Well, the vice chancellor, the president of the university, who has that $1.5 million salary linked to developing ties with China, he then basically cracked down on me. So we were barred from holding another protest. I held it anyway, and then that's when they first threatened my enrollment for the first time, and I just kept on going with my activism.
By the way, Drew was 6 months away from graduating.
Yes, I was 6 months away from graduating, and they started threatening my enrollment, and I didn't back down because I regarded it as a sickening attempt to try and limit free speech on behalf of the Chinese government. I ran for the University Senate, which is like the board that runs the university, as the student representative. And I basically ran on a platform. I'll oppose the university's terrible ties to the Chinese government. I will try and put the university's commitment to human rights first. I will try and change things from the inside. Students elected me in the biggest landslide in the UQ Senate history. What happened? They immediately tried to stop me from being seated to the UQ Senate. I made a post saying, as a UQ senator, I support Hong Kong, which is, not this radical statement. I'm simply expressing my support for democracy and human rights. And UQ then basically threatened to sue me, saying that I had put the university's reputation into disrepute. Well, whose reputation is being put into disrepute by supporting democracy and human rights? I mean, maybe the reputation is being damaged in China, but nowhere else in Australia or the free democratic world, because we all support human rights and democracy. But again, they were threatening to sue me. And I just refused to back down. And then so they basically begun compiling a research dossier on me. So we've now found through freedom of information requests that the university over a couple months was basically putting me under surveillance. So they compiled about 14,000 pages worth of documents over me.
Astonishing.
14,000 pages. I mean, they were using very high-powered lawyers to do this all. So they would have been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were basically just trying to look for anything they could use to try and kick me out of the university. It was like an investigation in search of a crime. And so they poured through my social media statements, basically looking for anything they could get me on, if you could narrowly, interpret my actions under the existing rules. There's this huge, broad student charter, and there are 50,000 students at UQ, and this broad student charter of, hundreds of different regulations. This student charter is probably breached, 10,000 times a day when students are on campus, but they don't go after every single student the way they went after me. The difference was that I was the most high-profile critic of the university administration's ties to China, which is worth $200 million a year. So they were willing to basically go to any length to try and go after me. Compile 14,000 pages worth of research on me. Then they compiled basically a 200-page expulsion dossier, 186 pages all up, basically outlining a list of 12 allegations as to why I should be expelled. Every single allegation was listed as the most serious offense possible. So, you know, they graded it from 1 to 3, 1 being moderate, 2 being major, 3 being a severe offense. Severe offenses being, you know, ordinarily tied to, you know, ordinarily things that would come under a tier 3 serious offense would be, you know, rape, violent assault, you know, serious crimes occurring on campus, on a student committing serious crimes on campus. What were the serious tier 3 offenses they listed for against me? Well, as I said, they were basically looking for anything. They put me under surveillance. So what was the stupid shit they put on me? They compared me using a pen in a campus gift shop to take down notes and putting the pen back on the shelf without paying for it. That was a tier 3 offense worthy of expulsion, you know, in the same category as grievous bodily harm and rape. That was what the university was, you know, leveling at me. They were piling shit onto me. They also said that a serious tier 3 offense I had committed was bringing the university's reputation to disrepute by posting in support of Hong Kong. I had apparently forced Chinese students to unenroll from their courses, damaging the universities financially by supporting Hong Kong. So they said that there was actually a couple. They said that there were a couple students who actually emailed the university saying, "I'm from China. I'm unenrolling because of this." It was an extraordinary document. This 186-page expulsion dossier, just basically listing the most absurd reasons to try and expel me. Everything was listed as the most serious offense possible, even despite how petty some of these allegations could be. They accused me of spreading racial hatred towards Chinese students because I had mocked the Confucius Institute in a post. So, for example, like 2 months after the coronavirus pandemic broke out, I mocked the Confucius Institute, which is an arm of the Chinese state. I mocked the Chinese state's authoritarian response to the pandemic, arresting journalists and doctors, trying to stop awareness and information about the pandemic from coming out to the world. I mocked that by wearing a hazmat suit outside the Confucius Institute, just basically, you know, undergraduate style satire. And they said that I was encouraging racist violence against Chinese students, trying to say that every single Chinese student at UQ was inundated with the disease and a disease carrier because attacking the Confucius Institute, which is an arm of the Chinese state, is apparently attacking all Chinese people. It was just the most absurd, ridiculous document ever. They piled everything they could at me. Probably the sickest one was like in January, a fellow student who was a great friend of mine, his name was Wilson, he committed suicide, and it was a nationally incident. It was an absolute tragedy. It was one of the hardest things I've ever dealt with in my entire life. And, you know, in the aftermath of that terrible suicide of my friend, there were some trolls at university who tried to attack me going, you know, I posted a eulogy to him, and for posting the eulogy and basically remembering him in a public way, they said, "Oh, you're trying to exploit his death for fame. You wanted your friend to die. You don't care that he committed suicide." It was sickening trolling, right? And I responded with quite a lot of vile stuff back. You know, I completely lost it at these people because I was in a very dark place emotionally. I'd just lost my friend. People were trolling me about his death. So I went off. I said, "How fucking dare you, blah, blah, blah," a torrent of insults and C words and stuff, as Australians are wont to do. And how did the university respond? So, you know, they were putting me under surveillance. They had the 14,000 pages worth of research on me. So they'd gone through all my social media. They found me going off at these students. They screenshotted me going off at the students, took away the context that I was responding to people trolling me about my mate's suicide. And they basically said, "Here's Drew bullying students, how sick, he should be expelled," taking away all the context. And they knew the context because, you know, the university had issued a big statement about his suicide. It was a very public thing. And yet they just basically just thought, well, Drew's emotional in the wake of the death of his friend. We can use that to expel him. It was just like a completely sickening sort of thing. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was just ridiculous. It was ridiculous, the petty nature of the allegations against me. It was just so transparently an attempt to basically pile any bullshit they could on me to try and remove me as a student, therefore kick me off the UQ Senate, basically make sure there were no more protests going on campus. And, you know, when it first happened, I thought my life was over. I was absolutely devastated. And then probably like a couple of days after, I just thought, well, if they're going to make me bleed, I'll make them bleed just as much. And I thought, okay, let's take this public. And I basically then took everything public. I lawyered up with one of Australia's best lawyers who represented me for free. And we basically went to war. And I mean, I ultimately lost because they kicked me off the UQ Senate. They removed me as a student for 6 months. We did, with thanks to the good efforts of my lawyer and so much pressure from not just in Australia, there were many members of parliament, mostly from the right probably, who spoke out in favor of me, in favor of my right to free speech. Newspapers ran editorials in support of me. British MPs wrote to the Australian ambassador to Britain, asking for information about my case and trying to support me. There was support from, the New York Times, now the LA Times has covered my case, the Washington Post. There was a tremendous amount of pressure, and my lawyer did an amazing job, and 50,000 people signed a petition against UQ. So in the end, they had to settle not just for not for expulsion, but for 6 months, a 6-month suspension. I was 6 months away from graduating, so it still destroyed. It's still really unsettled my life. I was removed from the Senate, so they still got that thing out of the way. They managed to bar me from campus for the 6 months. So they threatened to have police come after me if I even set foot on campus. Basically, like, they still had their way in the end, even though we made it very, very difficult for them. Chinese state media actually congratulated UQ, and the Chinese government said, good on you. This guy's like, they basically published articles in the Global Times, which is their propaganda mouthpiece, saying UQ should expel him. He's a rioter. He's an anti-Chinese racist. They also begun writing stuff in the Global Times, encouraging Chinese students not to study in Australia because there are racists like Drew Pavlou around. So there was a Chinese state media campaign against me. And basically, yeah, UQ listened to that Chinese state media campaign. Yes, they weren't successful with the full Monty expelling me, but they did listen to the Chinese state media campaign, got rid of me for 6 months. I was removed from the Senate. Basically, what it showed was that, yeah, if you protest the Chinese government on Australian campuses, you don't have free speech. You're not going to have your right to freedom of speech protected. Only one academic only two academics at the entirety of UQ. There are 10,000 academics at UQ. 2 academics publicly spoke out in favor of me. And that's because UQ has such an authoritarian culture now. No one wants to speak out because no one wants to go through what I went through. That's the state of free
They were making an example of you.
Yeah.
So what are you doing in your 6 months off?
Well, the 6 months is now kind of officially over, although I still have to wait till February to enroll again, which is when the semester starts. Basically, I just continued my activism. I continued writing. I started a nonprofit called Defend Democracy, and people can find that at defenddemocracy.com.au, trying to get people to join up to form a movement in support of human rights against Chinese government influence activities. And there was a period where we tried to get back at the university so they banned me from student elections because I was no longer a student. And if we won the student elections, I would be able to get back on the Senate. So one of my friends changed his name to Drew Pavlou so that there'd be a Drew Pavlou running on the ballot to try become the president of the student body and get back on the Senate. And he promised that, like, if students elected him, he'd hand it over to me. We came very close. We're like 50, 60 votes off in the end. But UQ made it impossible for us. It was fun. Like, it was a good way to try and stick our noses up at them, but UQ made it impossible. Every time I tried to step foot on campus to help campaign, they threatened to call the police. They had security come after me. They allowed like another student to register a fake Drew Pavlou party. So in the end, there were 3 Drew Pavlous, and they registered a fake Drew Pavlou party to dilute the vote and shit. In the end, it was impossible, but we tried our best to try and stick our noses up to them. Like, we're not giving in. So to this day, we're continuing to fight UQ. I've got an ongoing Supreme Court case against them, trying to sue them for damages, just to try and basically hit them where it hurts. They only care about money. So if we can try and hit them in the hip pocket, and I'll donate a lot of money if I do win. If we can hit them where it hurts, then hopefully it won't happen again to another student. That's the idea. And there's also, thanks to pressure, thanks to the pressure associated with my case, the Australian government announced an inquiry into Chinese government influence. So there's now an ongoing parliamentary.
The government announced the inquiry, or the university announced the inquiry?
Not the university. The university is
Yes.
the university continues. Oh, sorry, I better let the dog out. Sorry. So the university to this day maintains that it did nothing wrong. It says that it expelled me not for anything to do with China, not to do with free speech, but because I was this vicious, terrible, tyrannical bully, sowing violence and terror across the student body for many years. I mean, it's just a ridiculous claim, because my true record, as you stated, I won a poetry prize. I was on the Dean's List twice. At the start of the year during the pandemic, we organized a hamper fundraiser for international students and also domestic students who were starving during the pandemic, who were having a tough time economically. We raised $5,000 and delivered 250 free hampers to students across Brisbane and the southeast corner of Queensland to try and get through the pandemic. This is the guy they say I'm a terrible, cruel, violent, tyrannical bully. Right. That's the person that and you know, we delivered most of those hampers to international students, majority of them probably being Chinese. That's the guy that the Chinese government says is this anti-China rioter who hates the Chinese people and wants to, you know, carry out this racist, terrible campaign against them. We were delivering free hampers to students and Chinese students in need during the pandemic. So, I mean, that's the truth. But yeah, like we're continuing the campaign against them, hoping to try and beat them in the Supreme Court. The government, knowing that UQ will never investigate itself, the government announced a parliamentary inquiry into foreign interference at Australian universities. So that will be like the—
That's terrific. That's excellent. That's fantastic. Terrific,
right? So that will be the Australian equivalent almost of, like, you know, the congressional hearings where, like, they will call Peter Hoy and the men associated with what happened. They will call them to testify before Parliament. And this committee has the power to, you know, subpoena all documents, to look into email logs, to look into phone logs. I hope that the committee with those amazing powers will be able to actually look into whether there was collusion between the Chinese government, the consulate, and UQ when they were going after me. I hope it can look into whether the violent attacks at UQ were actually coordinated as well. I hope it can make some findings in these areas. And that will be tremendous. I think they've already kind of said in the papers that they're very likely to call me to come and testify in Canberra, the capital, before Parliament. So I hope we'll be able to basically bring light to all this stuff. It'll be
where
great.
Did the newspapers stand on your case? Are they with you or against you?
No, I think the majority of the media has been by my side. There have always been, you know, critics, and they are sort of the more tanky style, like, you know, the sort of like left-wing supporters of Marxist-Leninists, and they're all over Twitter and whatnot, and like they call me this vicious racist. And there have been some academics, there have been some Australian academics actually, you know, of that political bent, who wrote these terrible long-form articles about how I'm so racist and I'm this white supremacist, blah, blah, blah. In reality, I believe, you know, in the fundamental unity of all human people. I believe in the equality of all human beings, regardless of race, which is why I care about the human rights of Chinese people, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and Uyghurs. It's because, like, I believe they have the same fundamental human rights as Australians. That's why I should care about them as an Australian. But yeah.
Well, it sounds, this is going to sound like an incredible cliche, but you're a true hero of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is one of the most fundamental values this planet has ever invented.
I agree.
And I have put my life on the line several times for the same cause.
Yeah.
And I am so glad that you are doing what you are doing, that it's ridiculous. It is.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to know you. It's a pleasure to see what you're accomplishing.
Thank you so much.
Understatement, Drew. It's a vast understatement. So
thank you
we
very
should
much.
leave the poor audience alone. They've been with us for close to an hour and 15 minutes
Yes.
now. And I should sign off. This is Howard Bloom speaking to you from the future. It's your job. And let's do the staring into the camera.
Yes,
This is
of
Howard
course.
Bloom speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my
Okay.
job to make, and that Drew is, thank God, helping us make.
Thank you very much, everyone.